Imagine living for almost 1,000 years. You aren't just a character in a storybook. You are a witness. You saw the earth when it was young, and you saw it change. You might be the only one left who remembers what the old world looked like before the waves took it away. Ancient records say a man named Noah lived for 950 years. He spent 600 of those years in a world we can barely imagine. We are often taught that the past is a straight line of dates and names, but ancient texts from many lands suggest a deeper story about this time, a time they call the world before. Some traditions remember this age as a time when the natural rules of life were being pulled apart. They say it was a world filled with violence. The story suggests that beings described as not fully human had entered the story, bringing a kind of knowledge that was difficult for human hands to carry. These ancient stories speak of the Nephilim, powerful beings who were both famous and terrifying. We do not know exactly what they were, but researcher Gary Wayne interprets this as a hidden pattern, a long conflict that has been moving behind history for ages. Noah watched this world for 6 centuries. He saw the beauty, and he saw the darkness grow. And then a countdown began. Ancient texts say a warning was given. 120 years remain, a window of time for the world to find a new path before the end arrived. While the rest of the world moved on, one man was counting the days. He knew the clock was ticking. He knew a door was closing. And he knew that some warnings are only heard when the first drop of rain begins to fall. The question is, if you were the only one who saw the end coming, would anyone believe you? Imagine a world that was blotted out. Not just a kingdom or a city, but a whole version of the earth. In the records of the ancient world, this was known as the antediluvian age, the time before the Great Water. We usually hear history as a simple line of names and dates, but the story suggests there is a buried layer beneath it, a different version of the past than the one we usually hear. This lost world was not a simple place. Some traditions remember it as an age filled with violence. But this wasn't just the violence of wars. Ancient texts say the world no longer felt the way it should. It was as if the natural order of life was being shifted into something strange and new. The story suggests that these ancient people built great cities, but they lived with a deep sense of fear. Legends speak of forbidden knowledge shared with humans, secrets about the stars and the earth that were difficult for humans to carry. Behind high stone walls, people lived under the weight of powers they could not control. Ancient records say this world was crowded with beings who were more than human. These were the Nephilim, famous kings and terrifying giants. We do not know exactly where history ends and legend begins, but Gary Wayne interprets this as a hidden pattern, a long conflict moving behind the scenes of history. Imagine the feeling of living in a world that is losing its way. The story suggests that most people were so busy with their daily lives that they didn't see the dark signs growing around them. They didn't feel the earth shivering. They didn't know they were living on the edge of a cliff. But while the world was loud and violent, one man was watching the horizon in silence. He saw the corruption, he saw the giants, and he saw a door closing that no one else could see. The world was drowning in its own darkness long before the first raindrop fell. And then Noah heard the countdown begin. 120 years. Imagine standing as a witness for 6 centuries before the world you knew began to disappear. According to the oldest accounts, Noah lived for 600 years before the first raindrop ever fell. The story suggests he wasn't just a builder, He was a memory keeper. He was a man who remembered what the earth looked like before the world became unrecognizable. Then a specific number appeared in the ancient records, 120. Some traditions remember this as a final countdown, a window of time given to a world losing its way. We often think of history as moving fast, but the story suggests this was a warning that lasted longer than a modern human life. For 12 decades the clock was ticking, but we do not know if anyone but one family was listening to the beat. Ancient records say that while the countdown was running, the rest of the world stayed busy. They were eating, drinking, and marrying. They were building their own empires and chasing their own dreams. The story suggests a strange kind of tension here. One family working in the quiet heat of the day, while the rest of the world ignored the growing clouds on the horizon. In the middle of this busy world, a massive shape began to rise. It wasn't a palace or a temple. It was a dark, wooden structure built far from any ocean. It must have looked like a silent, strange warning sitting in the dust. We do not know what the people of that time thought as they walked past, but the story suggests the ark was more than a boat. It was a sign carved out of timber that the age was coming to an end. For 100 years, the work continued. Every wooden beam and every coat of black pitch was a choice to believe a warning that no one else wanted to hear. Gary Wayne interprets this as a saving of his house, a dedicated effort to protect a foundation for the future in a world that was being pulled apart by its own darkness. As the 120th year drew near, the air must have felt heavy. The ark stood finished, a massive, silent vessel waiting in the dry land. The world was still loud, still busy, and still laughing. But the countdown was almost at zero. The countdown was over, and the door was about to close. But what was it exactly that had made the world so dark that it needed to be buried in the deep? When we look back at the world before the flood, there is one memory that reaches further back than all the rest. Ancient texts say the earth was once home to the Nephilim, a name often remembered as the mighty ones of old. But these are not the cartoon monsters we see in modern stories. Some traditions remember them as something much more complex. Famous kings, powerful leaders, and warriors who left a deep mark on the memory of the ancient world. It is easy to call these stories fairy tales, but the story suggests these echoes are more than just imagination. In many faraway lands and distant traditions, there are memories of an age when giants walked the earth. The line between history and legend is unclear, but when cultures in faraway places tell similar stories, it is fair to ask why those memories stayed alive for so long. Ancient texts say these figures did not appear by accident. The story suggests a time when the boundary between heaven and earth became thin. Some traditions remember that knowledge was shared with humans that changed the way they saw the stars and the earth. We do not know exactly how these two worlds met, but the ancient records suggest this led to an age where the world was filled with violence. This is where we must look carefully at what we have. The fact is that names like Nephilim and Rephaim appear in some of our oldest written records. The legend is the stories of their massive size and their great power. Gary Wayne interprets this as a hidden pattern, a long conflict that has been moving behind the scenes of history for a very long time. Why does this mystery matter to the story of the flood? Because the story suggests the flood was not just about rain. Some traditions remember it as a reset for an age that had lost its way. The ancient texts suggest that the natural balance of life had been altered so much that, in order for life to continue, a new beginning was needed. As the memory of these mighty ones grew over the earth, the silence of one man's work became even louder. While the mighty ones were building empires they thought would last forever, one man turned away from the noise to begin a task that no one else understood. In a world of famous powers that seemed built to last forever, the only thing that truly mattered was a single wooden door about to close. In many stories we hear today, the ark is a small wooden boat, but ancient texts say it was something much more serious. It was a saving of his house, a massive structure standing silent in the middle of the dry land. The story suggests it was a monument to a coming change, a warning no one could ignore forever. For nearly 100 years, the sound of hammers echoed through the valley. Imagine that sound. It was the background music for an entire century. While children grew up and became old, and while cities rose and fell, one family stayed at their task. We do not know exactly what they said to those who watched them, but the story suggests a deep sense of tension. Every beam of wood was a reminder that time was moving forward. Ancient records say that life outside the construction site went on as if nothing was wrong. People were eating, drinking, and marrying. They were busy with their own lives, their own empires, and their own problems. To them, the massive shape in the dust was a mystery that didn't seem to matter. Some traditions remember that the world was so filled with its own noise that it could not hear the warning being built right in front of its eyes. For a century, the family worked with black pitch and heavy timber. This was not a project done in a hurry. It was the work of a lifetime. Researcher Gary Wayne suggests this was a dedicated effort to protect a foundation for the future. They were preparing because the story suggests the old way of life was reaching an end, and a new beginning was necessary. Then, there was the door. Ancient texts say the ark had only one door, and it remained open for a long time. The story suggests that as long as the door was open, there was still a chance for the world to listen. It was a symbol of an invitation. But a door that stays open for 100 years eventually has to close. Imagine the silence that fell when the hammers finally stopped. The wood was sealed, and the family stepped inside. We do not know what the neighbors thought when they saw the sky turn a deep, bruised purple. But the story suggests that once the door was shut, the age of the world before was over. The last hammer had fallen, and the door was shut. And then the world discovered that the clouds were not just a shadow, but the beginning of a change that would rewrite the story of the earth. Imagine a silence so deep it feels heavy. For 120 years, the world had heard the constant sound of hammers. Now, the hammers were still. The massive wooden door was shut. Ancient texts say that it wasn't a man who closed that door, but a power far greater. And then, the first drop of rain hit the dust. The story suggests it wasn't a soft rain, but the beginning of a dark ending for an entire age. The moment when the ancient records say the fountains of the great deep were broken open. We often see this as a simple story with a rainbow, but some traditions remember it as a terrifying reset. This was the moment the world before was buried. The stone cities, the mighty ones of old, and the secrets of the ancient world were all slowly covered by a vast, dark ocean. The story suggests that the history of that time was so different from our own that it was placed out of reach to let a new history begin. As the waters rose, the memory of the Nephilim disappeared beneath the waves. The famous kings who thought their power would never end were suddenly gone. Ancient records describe these beings as being held in a place of darkness, an ancient prison of everlasting chains known as the abyss. We do not know where this place is, but the story suggests that while the physical world was being covered by water, a boundary was being set against the powers that had tried to rule the earth. Imagine being inside that dark, wooden vessel, listening to the roar of a world being changed. For 40 days and nights, the earth was covered in water. There were no more wars and no more empires. There was only the sound of the deep. Some traditions remember this as the moment the earth was blotted out. For a moment, let the silence settle. Imagine the grief of a man whose entire world, the places he knew, the cities he had seen, the age he had survived, was now resting beneath a dark, rising sea. The story suggests that the flood did more than destroy. It moved things. It rearranged mountains and filled valleys. When the water finally began to go down, the world that Noah stepped out into was not the world he had known for 6 centuries. It was a new world, a quiet world, and a world with a very long memory. We do not know how much of the old world stayed beneath the waves and how much was waiting to be found again. The storm was over, and the world before was gone. But as the mud began to dry, a new question appeared. Was the darkness truly buried, or did something follow Noah through the door? Imagine the moment the heavy wooden door finally opened. Ancient texts say Noah stepped out into a world that was still and unfamiliar. He had 350 years of life left to live, but the world he had known for 6 centuries was gone. The great stone cities, the old powers and the memories of the mighty ones seemed buried beneath mud and silence. The story suggests that even though the landscape had changed, the memory of the world before remained. Noah and his family had become a living bridge between 2 different worlds. We might imagine them sitting by a small fire at night, perhaps sharing stories of the stars, the giants, and the things that were lost. Some traditions remember the beauty of the first world, but also the warnings that had been ignored for too long. This is where the mystery grows even deeper. If the flood was a new beginning, did anything from the old world manage to cross over? Ancient texts say that later in history, giant tribes known as the Rephaim appeared again in the land. How these remnants crossed from the old world to the new remains a profound mystery, one that the ancient texts record but do not fully explain. Some traditions remember that forbidden secrets were carved into stone to survive the water, while Gary Wayne interprets this as an unseen pattern that was not yet finished with the human race. The story suggests that history has a way of repeating itself. Even after the earth had been altered, the same old questions began to return. The same pride and the same violence seemed to move behind the scenes of the new world. It was as if the darkness had not been destroyed, but had only been waiting for the mud to dry. Noah had watched his world end in water, and he lived to see a new age begin. But he was not the only one who would have to flee a sudden catastrophe. Ancient records say that many years later, in a place of cities on a plain, another man named Lot would hear a similar warning. If the days of Noah were a pattern of water, then the story suggests the days of Lot were a pattern of fire. Why do these 2 stories always stand together in the warnings of old? We do not know all the answers yet, but we are beginning to see that history is not a straight line. It is a mirror. Noah survived the water, but the fire was yet to come. And the question we must ask is, if history is a mirror, what do these 2 stories show us when they are placed side by side? The hammers are silent now. The giant footprints have been washed away, and the mighty ones of old are only echoes in the deep. Ancient texts say the world Noah stepped into was a new beginning for the human race. But even in the sunlight of a new day, the memory of the world before remains. The story suggests that the flood didn't just bury the past. It set a boundary, a line between an age of giants and the world we live in today. But what if history is more than just a list of things that happened? Some traditions remember that the past is not a straight line, but a mirror. If we look closely at the days of Noah, the 120-year warning, the violence, and the door that finally shut, we begin to see a pattern. The story suggests that these events are not just dusty memories. They are part of a larger map that is still being drawn. Noah saw his world end in water, but he was only the beginning of the story. Ancient records say that many years later, another man named Lot lived in a place of great beauty and deep darkness called the cities of the plain. Like Noah, he heard a warning. Like Noah, he had to flee an ending. But while Noah's world was taken by the waves, Lot's world would face the fire. We do not know all the reasons why these two stories are placed together in the warnings of old. We only know that one speaks of water and the other speaks of fire. They stand like two pillars at the edge of history, asking us to look deeper at the stories we have inherited. For tonight, the fire is dying down, and the stars of the old world are fading. But the questions they left behind are still waiting for us in the dark. The question is, if Noah's story was a mirror of water, what will we see when we finally look into the mirror of fire?